In this video, I'd like to explore writing and solving literal equations from verbal expressions. And keep in mind, this is really just combining the last two topics we've talked about. First, writing equations from verbal expressions, and then also, we're going to notice that we're going to end up with a literal equation that we're then going to be able to solve for a variable. So in this first problem, we're asked to first write an equation and then solve for the given variable. And we see here that we have the sum of 2 times x and y is equal to a. So if we break this down into our key terms, we can see the first key term I have is the word sum. And as soon as I hear the word sum, I should be thinking addition. So I know, okay, that word sum is telling me that I'm going to have addition by something, so I'm going to start by writing a plus down here. Now the question is, well, what are the two things we're adding together? Well, here's our first thing. 2 times x, or in other words, this is literally saying the term 2x. So the first thing that's being added is this term 2x. I can write that in. And then, well, what's the second thing that's being added? I can see this next term here, y. So I must be adding 2x and y. The question now is, okay, what else is happening? Well, I have this term equal. So I immediately know that I have this equation equal to something. So this closes off the left-hand side of our equation. And the question is, well, what is it equal to? And that's where we see this key term a. So I know that 2x plus y must be equal to a. So here's our little equation. Now I simply need to solve this for x. So this is where we're going to use all the solving techniques we've been using for quite a few weeks now. I see two different operations here. Multiplication between the 2 and the x, and then also the addition of the y. Now remember, when we solve equations, we solve them in the reverse order of our order of operations. And if you remember, I'll put this over here, our order of operations is normally PEMDAS, or parentheses, exponents, multiplication and division, addition, and subtraction. But because we're solving, we're doing this in the opposite order. So I'm going to do this backwards. In other words, we're going to start with the addition and the subtraction. So I do notice that I have this addition by y. This has to be the first thing I deal with. So I'm going to first subtract the y, which is the inverse of addition. And I notice that my new equation will now be 2x, because positive and negative y are inverses. Those add to 0. And I'm just left with equal to a minus y. Now if I bring this equation over, I need to solve 2x equals a minus y for x. And the only operation left on the side of the x is the multiplication by 2. So I'm going to divide both sides of this equation by 2. Keeping in mind that here's the center of our equation. Because multiplication and division are inverse operations, those divide to 1. And I'm now left with just x equal to a minus y, all divided by 2. And there's our final answer. In this next example, again, we want to go left to right in our written expression, identifying key terms, first writing our literal equation. So the first thing I see is the term quotient, and quotient means division. So I'm recognizing here that we are going to have a division sign, but I talked about in the previous video, I'd really like to rather talk about quotient as a fraction. And remember, when we're talking about quotient, the order does matter. So the first term is going to go in the numerator, the second term is going to go in the denominator. So first, let's find out what comes first. And that's this w, the quotient of w. And since this is listed first, I know w is going to go on the top of the fraction. And now the question is, well, what goes in the bottom? Well, the second term is x. So that's going to go in the denominator of our quotient. Now notice, the quotient of w and x doesn't talk anything about a quantity of these w and x being grouped together. So these are simply going to go one on top, one on the bottom, and now we're just going to keep writing our equation. So next key term here is the word minus. So I know that now I'm subtracting something away from this fraction. And again, I know that this subtraction is not part of the quotient because I already took the quotient of two separate things, w and x. So the quotient's already ended and now we're moving on. Now what is being subtracted from that fraction? Well, that is the y. So I'm going to take away a y from the w over x. And now we're going to keep going here. I have this keyword is, which we remember is an equal sign. And what is it equal to? Well, that's this z. So I have w minus y equals z. Okay, so just go through that again. The quotient of means that the next two things are going to be the top and the bottom of a fraction. I see w and x, so w is the top, x is the bottom. Then minus y, so I subtract y, and is z implies equals z. So now we need to solve this equation. And again, I want to look at the operations. I have division of w and x, and I have subtraction. And by our inverse order of operations, or in other words, opposite of PEMDAS, I need to start by dealing with the addition or the subtraction. So first, I'm going to deal with the subtraction by the inverse order of operations, which means I'm going to add y to both sides. Remembering that addition is the inverse of subtraction. Now, negative y and positive y add to 0, so all I'm left with then is this w over x equal to a z plus y. So if I bring this equation over here, again, w over x equals z plus y, I simply need to solve for w, so I'm looking at, well, what else has happened to the w? I have this division by x, so I'm going to multiply both sides of the equation to be the inverse of that division. So both sides of the equation here, I'm going to multiply by this x, or in other words, x over 1. Now multiplication by x and division by x are inverse operations. So those are going to divide to 1, leaving us with just w on the left-hand side of this equation. Now to simplify our right-hand side, I simply have to distribute because I am multiplying the entire side, giving me xz plus an xy. And that's our final answer. We now see another example, and we notice the key word here, quantity, which is going to make this problem a little bit different. But first, I want to start with the first keyword, the product, and this should immediately imply that we are talking about some type of multiplication. So I'm multiplying something by something else. So I'm going to immediately write this multiplication dot down here. Now here comes this key word, the quantity. Whenever I see the word the quantity, we should immediately be thinking that something is about to be grouped into parentheses, or in other words, more than one term is going to be placed inside a set of parentheses as the first part of our multiplication. So the question is, well, what is going inside these first set of parentheses? And if we keep reading, we'll notice that right after the quantity, well, what is the quantity of? It's the quantity a plus b. So in other words, inside those parentheses is going a plus b, and a plus b is now the first part of our multiplication. So the product of, well, what is it the product of? The quantity a plus b. Now what is the quantity a plus b being multiplied by? Well, here comes the second part of our multiplication, and c. So I'm going to write a plus b in parentheses times c, and then what is this is d telling us? Well, that's telling us that it's equal to d. It's a little tricky because of that quantity term, but remember, quantity is implying that we're going to start grouping more than one thing together. So when we say the product of the quantity a plus b and c, it's literally saying A plus B is the first part of our multiplication because the quantity A plus B, and then C is the second half of our multiplication. Okay, so now to solve this equation, we have to first follow the order of operations in reverse. So opposite of PEMDAS. Normally parentheses would be the first thing we simplify, but because we're solving, it's going to be the last thing we deal with. So first I have to deal with everything outside of the parentheses, right? And if I'm solving for A is inside the parentheses, that's going to be the last thing I deal with, which means the first thing I have to deal with is this multiplication by C. So I'm going to apply then to both sides of our equal signs the inverse of multiplication. And I remember that the inverse of multiplication is division. And notice how I'm dividing not just the C, but the whole side of the equation. Now, because though multiplication and division are inverse operations, C and C are simply going to divide to 1, and now I'm just left with A plus B equal to D over C. And you'll probably notice I didn't even bother to put the parentheses around A plus B anymore because there's no longer anything else in the equation. So now I just need to solve for A. I'm going to apply the inverse of the addition that we see. And then if we can write our final answer over here, the addition and B and the subtraction of B are inverse operations. They add to 0. So I'm just going to be left with A equals, and we still have the D over C, but now we're going to be subtracting the B. And there's our final answer. Last example I want to do of you, again, involves that quantity term. So let's go through this. First, I see the term H. So there's our first variable, H. Well, what's happening to H? I see this keyword times, which implies multiplication. So I'm immediately going to be multiplying H by something. What is it being multiplied by? Here's that keyword, the quantity. So quantity immediately implies, well, H is being multiplied by more than one thing that are being grouped inside parentheses. What's going inside those parentheses? Well, apparently it's the quantity A minus C. So I'm going to have A minus C inside these parentheses. And what's happening with this? Well, it is equal to, or in other words, an equal sign. And what is it equal to? Looks like it's equal to M. So I can write this, and here's our equation. So in order to solve this, all I have to do is say, well, I'm solving for A. Inside the parentheses is the last thing I want to do because of the opposite order of operations. So I'm simply going to divide both sides by H because this is the inverse operation of multiplication by H. So multiplication by H and division by H, divide to 1. And now all I'm left with is A minus C equal to M over H. So to finish up this problem, I'll bring this equation up here to the right. So if I have A minus C equals M over H, we need to solve this. Well, I'm trying to solve for A. What's happening to A? It's being subtracted by C. So I'm going to add C, the inverse of subtraction, to both sides. Inverse operations are going to add to 0. So I'm left with the answer A equals M over H plus C. Okay, so now there are 4 on your own problems I'd like you to try on your own, and then we'll take a look at this on next class.